We have to warn you up front, some of the things we talk about in this series will be disturbing for some listeners.
So you should exercise caution, and please remember, this podcast is unlikely to be suitable for children.
We are grateful for your support of the Cold Case Foundation.
Stay safe, wherever you are. In the first full season of Out of the Cold, we explored the case of serial killer Robert Rhodes, turning to the experts from the Foundation team to help learn the lessons which can prevent truck driving criminals from offending in future. In Season 2, which is at the start of production now, we will be taking a deep dive into another case, showing how expertise and the dedication of the investigators turned a mystery into a conviction.
In between, we didn't want to leave you with nothing. So, the team thought carefully about it, and James wants to tell you some of his formative stories from policing. We feel that these give you some valuable insight into what it's like to be at the scene when the worst has happened or is still happening. We protected real people by changing some of the details relating to these incidents.
Investigators and first responders don't learn most of their skills from books. We learn through sound, sight, and smell. We learn from each other and from listening to those little feelings, but being able to recognise when they're leading us up the garden path. I want you to learn about those sights, sounds, and smells, and how that little voice can manifest, so that you can understand what the reality of casework is. I'm James Patrick, Director of Intelligence at the Cold Case Foundation, and this is Out of the Cold. New Year is always a good time to think about the stuff that we hold on to, and it's true that sometimes we hold on to too much. In most cases, we think of this in emotional terms, the damage or negative thoughts we carry along with us, the ones which sometimes weigh us down so much that thoughts turn to making it all stop. Sadly, all too often, this emotional weight is what leads to tragic suicides. But there are other types of weight that we carry, and for some people, this manifests as hoarding, which is the retention of physical items, in some cases to the detriment of their quality of life. In many cases, hoarding starts with one simple question. What if I need this thing that I'm about to throw away one day in the future? Very often it starts with plastic bags and newspapers or magazines, but it includes photos, boxes, all manner of goods and old clothes. For some it can include knickknacks and even items retrieved from dumpsters. There have been a few TV programs about it, but they treat the subject like a kooky joke. The truth is, it's everything but funny. As things escalate, what initially manifests as an anxiety disorder, fear sparked by decisions to throw things away, can rapidly spiral into depression, distress, and even paranoia that others will take the items away from them. This drives isolation and impacts severely on relationships, the loneliness driving more hoarding as what is, I suppose, a way of seeking comfort or stability or control over something. Then there are, of course, the physical risks. Living space reduces to a point which can be horrifying, which I'll tell you about soon, and fire becomes a present danger too. On top of this, there are these very real health hazards, especially where they have pets, and worse still, hoarders tend to learn to live with broken appliances, so well below the quality of life many of us might expect. It's a collision, really, of the tidy and the untidy mind. It's been linked to OCD, eating disorders, and even psychosis. Treatment is a difficult prospect, mainly because there tends to be an avoidance of contact. So many of the health interventions you might expect take longer than usual to happen, Or, in some cases, they may never happen at all, purely because they aren't connected to people in the world outside their house. I've met a few hoarders over the years, some angry and unpleasant, others terrified, but almost always those that I've met have undergone some kind of traumatic event or loss of a loved one which has shifted their behaviour and led to an out-of-control compulsion. I think, on some level, they were all trying to control something in a world they've lost some stake in, without a direct choice about that stake being lost. It's desperately sad. There's this one incident and one hoarder which stays with me, even though we never met in the traditional sense, and that was in London, around 2010. Colleagues were called to a concern for welfare on a London estate, on one of the middle floors. By estate, I mean a block of flats, one of the Victorian red bricks, which predated the towering concrete misery hubs that were built when England misguidedly sent the poor to them after the slums were destroyed in the 50s and 60s. My colleagues couldn't get through the door, and this was one of the rare occasions when the fire service had to be called out to cut the door in half, removing the top half of it, leaving a weird urban stable just without a horse. Most doors you can get through. PVC ones are easy. You can kick the centre panel straight out of many of them. The ones with cages, well, you can pop the hinges using airbags. Others need you to use the big red key, which is what we all call the two-handed battering rams. I remember this one concern for safety job at a block of flats which had been partially modernised, and it featured this special type of Italian front door with locking bolts driving vertically and horizontally into the walls, floor and ceiling. Now, a normal door will survive, at best, 2 hits of an enforcer. But this one took 140 hits, and it wasn't the door, but the wall which gave way in the end. And that is when we introduced ourselves to an elderly deaf woman with a canary on her shoulder. She was as surprised to see us as we were to see her drinking a cup of tea and reading a book. The door the fire service cut in half for my colleagues wasn't a so-called Italian mafia door. The lower half of it was simply blocked shut by an 18-inch secondary floor of stacked newspapers which stretched into what I can only describe as a dim cave. I was the duty sergeant that day, and 2 of my probationers were in attendance. They were just emerging back into the light and assured me that they'd searched the flat and nobody was inside. I leaned in the door and straight away I could smell human decomposition. Subtle, but definitely there. "Are you sure about that?" I asked. Their smiling faces nodded at me, full of the surety that only comes from being a bit green. My nose, on the other hand, knew better. "Come on," I said. "Let's go retrieve the deceased," watching their puzzled faces as I climbed over the remains of the door and into one of the strangest hoarder houses I've ever been in. With the floor already much higher than it should have been, the corridor felt small, but within a couple of feet, the walls started to close in too. I felt more like Alice in Wonderland than a copper. Stacks of newspapers and magazines grew from the floor like pillars, eventually meeting in near-perfect arches overhead. The corridor shrank so much that you had to step sideways through parts of it. Eventually, this passage finished in a wall of paper, with a 3-foot by 3-foot crawl hole set just below the ceiling. Compacted paper steps led to it. I looked through, smelling rotting trash, but no death, and then wriggled through the gap. Potholing is not generally something you expect to do in a London flat, but life really is full of surprises. On the left was a kitchen, lined completely with stacked newspapers, leaving a human-sized gap. The design in there was fascinating. The paper had almost been carved out around one burner on a gas hob. There was a metal camping kettle sat on it, and there was another carve-out surrounding the sink, facing a small newspaper bulkhead window about 6 inches up and down, and that was the only natural light in the whole apartment. How the whole thing hadn't caught fire was a mystery. The living room, if you could call it that, was much the same, but there was no body. This whole section of the flat was clear. "Told you, nobody here," my junior colleague said, feeling cocky. "Told you there was nobody here," my junior colleague said, feeling cocky. "Come along," I said. "You called the undertaker yet?" "What for?" the other one asked. I rolled my eyes and climbed back out into the corridor. There was one normal doorway leading off the corridor, with a door designed to open about halfway. The room was stacked to the ceiling, wall to wall, with papers, but they'd collapsed on one side. I took one quick glance inside, no more than a second. "There we are," I said. "Where?" the probationers asked in unison. "You tell me," I replied, and stepped inside. They squinted, they leaned, they shrugged. I pointed into the tumbled mess of papers, at the single lock of hair protruding about an inch from the tumbled stacks at the far end of the room. "There." "How did you fucking spot that?" one asked. "Practice," I said. The process afterwards was painstaking, more like archaeology than policing. That room, as it turned out, that you would have had no way of knowing, was a bathroom. We moved the papers slowly to the opposite side of the room and out into the corridor, careful not to disturb any more of the hundreds of pounds of material around and above us, causing a cave-in. The poor woman we excavated was mummified, at least from the waist up, in hot, dry paper. Then we got to the worst bit. She'd been sitting on the toilet when her own hoard crashed down and entombed her, and undernourished as she was, she would have stood no chance at moving the weight. This meant that, while the top half of her was dry and mummified, her lower half had been in a moisture trap which had been heating up. She disintegrated from the lower ribcage downwards, leaving us with one of the most macabre sights you could imagine. The brief investigation beyond was just desperately sad. The woman had lived a lonely life, and her colleagues thought she was simply on holiday. Days went by before anyone even noticed she was gone. After this brief word about the Cold Case Foundation, I'll recap the learning for you all and wrap this episode up.
Out of the Cold is not just a podcast. It's part of a wider piece of work the Cold Case Foundation is doing at coldcase.live.
A platform and app where we share our expertise in articles, training courses, and web series with people who want to support the foundation through small monthly or annual donations.
You can become a supporter of the Cold Case Foundation by visiting coldcase.live/join. It will cost you just $3.99 a month. The funds we raise are put to use in the ongoing investigation of hundreds of real-world cold cases.
We are working across the world in conjunction with law enforcement agencies to bring families the peace they deserve.
You can follow us on social media too, by searching for Cold Case Live on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube.
We are always glad to speak to new people. You are the reason we do all of this.
I've told you about this incident because it was formative for me in a couple of ways. While I dealt with a lot of death by that point, this particular incident gave me an in-depth insight into the extreme lifestyle of hoarding and the unique risks posed when investigating incidents in those premises. A gas hob in a carved-out shelf of stacked dry paper was one clear risk, and the mine shaft collapse waiting to happen, the very nature of the hoarded cavern, was another. A fire in that flat would have torn through the whole block, potentially killing multiple people. I've learned that there isn't a real mechanism for addressing these risks, and most councils will only intervene in hoarding where the health hazard or the unsightly mess becomes externally visible, and that could either be in the form of rats or in complaints about the impact on house prices. A lot of hoarders are only discovered later in life as healthcare interventions become more common, and that's actually what exposes the problem. And this means that there's a real gap in society and the way that we identify isolated people or those people suffering from a mental health crisis. even one which is going on for years. The fact that nobody noticed the lady from this flat was missing for a while underscores this in the most depressing way. I think about the poor woman a lot. How the city of London swallowed her up and she became invisible, building herself a cave to make it small again, a place where she felt close and connected to the very structure of it, if nothing else. The policing considerations in a case like this are the easy bit. It's just about following your nose and looking for the small details in chaos. My junior colleagues learned that lesson and never forgot it. The tiniest thing can tell the whole story of an incident. The broader learning here is about the importance of identifying signs of mental health crisis across society and implementing better mechanisms to help people early on. You might notice somebody becoming tense or anxious, or becoming obsessed with repetitive actions. You might see them collecting things, or even struggling to throw things away. You might see them counting coins in their purse or items on their desk a few times a day. If you notice somebody starting to show signs of OCD, do something. Especially if you're a family member, employer, colleague, or somebody else with a duty of care or a sense of decency. Make sure that they're on the radar of the professionals who can help them. And the next time you see an empty chair at work, just remember, it doesn't cost anything to ask where your colleague is. You might save their life. Stay safe.
Thank you for listening to Out of the Cold and supporting the ongoing work of the Cold Case Foundation.
If you aren't already a member, there's a place waiting for you at coldcase.live for the monthly price of a coffee.
You can also help spreading the word by sharing this podcast with your friends, family, and social networks, and by leaving a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts.
Until next time,
stay safe. Out of the Cold was written and presented by James Patrick.
It was produced for Cold Case Live by SOCINT in association with AJJ Entertainment LLC.
The Cold Case platform and all of our digital content is made possible through SOCINT.
Original music is sourced through Storyblocks, and the featured tracks are Slide the Guitar by Neil Cross and Deep in the Bayou by Patrick Smith.